first of all, I'd like to come to Father Michal Paluch and invite you, Father, to say something about this important question of solidarity, equality, and social justice. If we were all together, I would be saying to you, you have the floor, but on this occasion, I say to you, you have the microphone, and you have the video as well. It's good to see you.
Thank you very much for this invitation. It's a pleasure and an honor for me to work with you during this afternoon. And first of all, congratulations on this initiative. Solidarity understood as a set of events, the social movement that started 40 years ago in Poland, and understood as a powerful idea of social transformation, has a lot of potential that should be better known and explored. I'm happy that the St. John Paul II Institute of Culture at our university takes part in this initiative. My contribution will be divided into two parts. In the first of them, I would like to remind us about how John Paul II, the privileged commentator and to some extent participant of the Solidarity movement, attempted to articulate it. In the second part, I will try to identify the biggest challenge for us today in our attempts to put this ideal into practice. We find a definition of solidarity in the encyclical Sollicitudo Rei Socialis. We are in 1987, a few years after the beginning of the workers' movement in Poland, and just after the beginning of perestroika in the Soviet Union, but before the Polish Round Table and the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. Reflecting on interdependence in the contemporary world, the Polish Pope describes a moral and social attitude that should be the right response to it. He calls it solidarity, and he continues in the following way, quote, "This then is not the feeling of vague compassion or shallow distress at the misfortunes of so many people, both near and far. On the contrary, it is a firm and persevering determination to commit oneself to the common good. That is to say, to the good of all and of each individual, because we are all really responsible for all." It's the number 38. Well, one might be a little bit disappointed by such a description. It stresses firmness in the pursuit of the common good, but it is not very specific. Nevertheless, let's note its vaulting ambition. Solidarity should take into account the good of all and of each individual, because we are all really responsible for all. As you can see, John Paul II thinks about solidarity very inclusively and really in global terms. To have the whole picture of the essential elements of JP2's understanding, I would even like to say project of solidarity, I would like to add one more quote. It will help us to see what was the specifically Christian component that had been added to the workers' social movements by the equivalent Polish movement, Solidarity. In the same year, 1987, during his visit to Poland at the Mass organized in Gdańsk, the cradle of the Solidarity movement, John Paul II presented one of the most concise and accessible descriptions of what solidarity is and should be about. By the way, I still remember the sweat on my back as I listened to these words in a big crowd that day. It was a very hot day. Bear one another's burdens. This succinct sentence of St. Paul is an inspiration for interpersonal and social solidarity. Solidarity means one another together. And if a burden is to be borne, it is borne together in community. It is never one against another or ones against others. It never implies that a burden should be borne by a man alone without the help of others. Struggle must not be stronger than solidarity. The program of struggle must not be above the program of solidarity. Otherwise, our too heavy burdens are growing. End quote. In the light of this short, simple, but powerful passage, we can grasp that the Christian touch in the approach to the social question brought in itself the invitation to get out of the logic of the class war and enter into the logic of mutual respect and cooperation. Instead of the us against them, which could have ended up breaking people apart, John Paul II wanted the solidarity that unites across real and valuable differences between workers and employers, even between solidarity movement members and the communist establishment. It might be taken as crazy and impossible, going against the first experiences of solidarity in the workers' movement that wanted to solve the social question at the end of the 19th century. But what happened in the Eastern Bloc after those words had been written and pronounced was felt by my generation as a huge encouragement to recognize that this new Christian edition of solidarity is not only a beautiful ideal, but that it may really function. I want to stop the first part of my presentation here. As we can see, the project of solidarity articulated by JP2 on the basis of the Polish experience was understood by him as firmness in the pursuit of the common good. It was inclusive, keeping a place in this project for all, and non-violent. Well, I hope that we can admit that we need such solidarity everywhere and in every time. It is a dream we share. It would be so beautiful to be able to live such solidarity on all levels of our social fabric, starting in families, our local and professional communities, and going upwards within international relationships. If this is a dream that so many of us share, why is it so difficult today to put this dream into practice? My answer to this question is because of the way we live our identities. What do I mean? Well, it is not enough to have a good ideal. It may be put into practice only if you have the right attitude towards it. Pardon my example, although we remain in the field of imagination of the last quote, bearing burdens. If you want to become a master of weightlifting, you need to know how to approach weight. If you don't, you will break your backbone in the first training session. My apprehension is that unfortunately we are losing the right attitude towards different burdens, challenges that we should confront in the world today. And as a result of that, we are starting to have severe problems with the backbones of our common projects. Let me remain with John Paul II as our main guide through the problems we have with solidarity today in order to explain what I mean. If you look at the way he proposed to us to live our identity, you see a man attempting to create a warm and respectful place for others, reaching out to the people who do not share the Christian faith and convictions. As you probably remember, he was the first Pope who organized a meeting for the leaders of the world's religions and who paid a visit to a synagogue and a mosque. He was the first Pope to ask for forgiveness for the sins that Catholics had committed during the past centuries. Well, it is important to notice that all this happened because of the strong identity he espoused. Strong Christian identity was not an obstacle in the way of those historic gestures, but their necessary basis. In a world imbued with different postmodern narratives, we seem to believe more and more that the only way to create a warm space for others is through weakening our own identities. In other words, we will be able to become respectful of others, not because of who we are, but only in spite of who we are. And we think this is especially so when it comes to the case of religious identities. But this is an illusion. The man produced by our postmodern ideologies, a man without qualities, if I may use the title of a prophetic work by Robert Musil, is not able to create any warm places around himself. He's more and more self-centered and focused on experiments with its identity without any real interest in others. And without the social energy to create warm places for others, any project of solidarity has no necessary foothold in order to be set up and to flourish. Thus, the claim I would like to make in the second part of my contribution is the following. Without our capacity to live our identity fully, taking into account its religious aspect, we will not be able to have the necessary social energy to maintain our big social projects focused on social justice and on reducing inequalities in our societies. Such projects may last for a while out of inertia, maintained on the basis of a sense of post-colonial or post-World War II guilt. But if they have lost their footholds in the depths of a self-confident identity, sooner or later, such great and noble projects are nevertheless condemned to expire. Thank you for your attention.
Father Michal, thank you very much indeed for that very thoughtful and thought-provoking intervention. I wonder if I might pick up on just one or two things to tease them out a little bit, though you spoke with great clarity. The first question, I suppose, that came to my mind was this question of the identity or well-being of the individual as over against that of the community. You mentioned this when you were speaking about solidarity and when you were speaking about how we approach this question. And it does seem to me that this is a quite major issue. It's a major issue often within the church, but it's a big issue within society and geopolitics. Those societies which hold the well-being of the community as the primary issue and others which hold the well-being of the individual. I wonder if you can say a little bit more about that dilemma, if dilemma it is, when we approach the question of solidarity.
Well, I would say that the church, and what's more, the Christian theology has extraordinary resources to address this problem because of our thinking about God. One in a community and one and community at the same time. So I would say that to some extent it is, I'm starting very, very high as you understand, but I think that really it's of relevance for the whole issue. I think that this model of thinking about God gives you the main resources to think about the individualistic part of our identity and the community part of our identity as reconciled and understand that if we leave some tensions, you know, in the world, it's quite obvious, especially taking into account the postmodern way of thinking. I think that it's a challenge that might be overcome thanks of the resources and experiences we have in the past as well. So I would say you should well, I don't want to bring you too much in this direction, but don't let's think about the structure and the dynamic of the Eucharist, which is for one on to some extent, and for the community as well, and one without community doesn't exist, and the community without this one doesn't exist. So I would say there is a lot of reflection inside of the Christian theology and of the Church, which may be understood as resources, to see how to overcome this huge challenge today.
Thank you very much indeed, and I suppose on one understanding of the nature of the Trinity as well, one is thinking about that which is one and that which is more than one at the same time. So yes, there's much to be explored, I think, there. Well, I'd like to come next to Dr. Ivereigh, Dr. Austen Ivereigh, and those of you who haven't known his name before now will surely know his name from this book, which he produced along with Pope Francis, Let Us Dream, the Path to a Better Future. And of course, we are hoping very much that solidarity is part of that path to a better future. It is, for those of you who haven't read it, well worth reading. And from my experience of it, well worth reading the whole way through, because I think there's a development of thinking which I find very interesting indeed. But we're not there to focus on the book, excellent though it is, and I'm sure he will have some things to say about it. But Austen, we come to you now and invite you to make your intervention.
Thanks very much, John. Thank you for the chance to be with you today and to talk, if I may, mainly about Pope Francis's insights in Let Us Dream. Forgive me if after speaking to you, I have to leave. I'm afraid I won't be part of the discussion for important family reasons, which I wasn't aware of when I took the invitation. But I have 10 minutes now just to talk about what I think is Francis's vision for solidarity, for fraternity, as I think he would also say at this moment. Now, this book, Let Us Dream, is the first book ever written by a pope in response to a specific crisis, the crisis that we're now going through, the COVID crisis. And of course, Francis is not alone in saying that we will be different after this crisis. He is not alone in also saying that he hopes that we have a better world after this crisis, that this crisis becomes an opportunity for a rethink or a reset. He's not the only one saying that, everybody is. But I think he's probably the only leader on the world stage right now who understands the process of conversion that is implied in a crisis. Now, what I mean by that is that for Francis, and remember, he is above all, he has insights about politics, about society, about economics, but he's above all a spiritual leader. His concern is to how we allow God into our story and into history, and specifically how God can enter into this crisis. So his concern, to put this theologically, is how we open ourselves to the graces that are on offer at this time from a loving, merciful God who always accompanies us, especially in times of tribulation. And conversely, what are the obstacles and the temptations which prevent us from receiving those graces? Or to put another way, how is it, in a very secular way, how is it that some crises change us for the better and others, frankly, change us for the worse, or we don't learn from? And there's a challenge at the heart of this book, which is to say that the crisis can only change us. We will only be left better or worse. Those are really the only two options. And looking back on history, one can see that that is true. So my invitation, when I first got in touch with him to suggest this book, was that he would help to teach us how we can change, how we can allow ourselves to change through this crisis. So the book is constructed on a three-part, very familiar dynamic, that is, if you know the Latin American church, see, judge, act, or as Francis would prefer to say, contemplate, discern, propose, which is the dynamic, the very pattern of conversion, that we must begin by seeing, and the seeing is what we see and how we see is important. In a crisis, it's easy to go back in on ourselves, to seek distraction, to seek to go back to where we were, or simply to batten down the hatches and wait for the storm to pass. All of those are ways of avoiding the graces on offer. So what he's inviting us to do is to see what this crisis has revealed. And we begin by looking at the margins. We look at places of pain and suffering, like Jesus going through Galilee, going to places on the edges of the world, because it is from there that we see the world better. And it is to allow ourselves to see the pain and the suffering, and to allow that to affect us, to move us, to open our hearts and minds. And in doing so, of course, we're overwhelmed by the challenges that we are faced. And I mean, it's obvious, and he talks about this, if we look at this crisis, what has it revealed about our health system, about the way we treat our elderly people, about who is important in our society. I mean, we know, we're all very familiar with those lessons because we've been living with them this last year. But the point is that, are we able to look at that and say, well, actually, is this telling us how we organize ourselves and how we should be organizing ourselves? So the seeing the reality is really important. And then the second part, the choosing, the discerning, because what is revealed in a crisis is where our values really lie, what is really important to us. And it's in the, as he says right at the beginning, a crisis is a time of testing. It's a time of sifting, to use that very biblical word, a time when our hearts are tested. And of course, we've seen this in our governments, in the way they've responded to the crisis. We've seen it in leaders, in institutions, where, frankly, faced with this crisis, where have they put their priorities? And in that, we reveal, therefore, where the Spirit of God is, the Spirit of good is, the Spirit of fraternity, and where is the spirit of selfishness, of denial, and so on. And the clarity that comes with a crisis is where Francis puts his hope, because it is in seeing things more clearly that we're then able to determine how we should build back better, to use that rather hackneyed phrase. So I can't in a few minutes, summarize Francis's take on this, just to invite you, as John did, to read the book and to allow yourself to be carried on by that. But just to end with the third part, which is called A Time to Act, where Francis takes this discernment and he takes everything we've learnt in this crisis, and he says, are we now willing to build a society based not on the mythological idea of individual sovereignty, but rather on the principle of fraternity, the principle of solidarity to which we're speaking today? And if we do that, what does that look like? And one of the big and important messages from the third part is that we need a different kind of economy in which gives access to work and gives access to the goods of the earth to everybody, while at the same time protecting the planet. That's a very different kind of economy, which is one based on perpetual growth and on maximization and so on. And of course, if we do that, then we need a different kind of politics to set different goals for the economy. And the kind of politics we need is neither liberal technocracy nor populism, which exploits popular anguish as a means of power, but rather a politics which involves a genuine protagonism of the people. And it's interesting that we began today by remembering St. John Paul II and the Solidarity movement in Poland, because that was a great example of what Francis calls in Spanish a movimiento popular, a popular movement, a movement of the people, which arises from the margins. It arises from ordinary people who organize. And why do they organize and how do they organize? Because they have a sense of their own dignity. And the sense of that dignity arises, which was such a great theme for St. John Paul II, that dignity which arises from the encounter with a merciful God. And it is that encounter, that understanding, that awareness that is triggered by that encounter that awakens in us the sense of our dignity being, on the one hand, not respected, and on the other hand, that leads us to unite with others to seek to express that dignity. So his rather beautiful and startling thesis, if I can call it that, at the end of the book, is that what our crisis reveals is the loss of the sense of dignity of the people. And it is in the recovering of the sense of the dignity of the people that we will be able to create a better world, a world which is based around and centered on fraternity, on solidarity, on justice. And we do that because once we put the dignity of the human person at the center, when it becomes the organizing principle of our politics and economics and society, things begin to look a bit different. So he ends in a very kind of practical way talking about land, labor, and lodging, which would be, if you like, the three fundamentals that people need to thrive and survive. Land, not in the sense necessarily of physical property, but if you like, of ownership of goods. And labor, above all. I mean, work is one of the big themes at the moment. We live in a precariat. We've gone from a proletariat to a precariat, where work has become insecure. People are deeply anxious. How can we create that different kind of economy and that different kind of organization based on fraternity? And so that's the invitation of the book. So it's an invitation for us not to lose the opportunity of this crisis, not to miss out on the graces that are on offer to us at this time. Very little faith in current structures, very little faith in contemporary politics, but enormous faith and enormous hope in the stirring of the movement of dignity from the margins, which he sees in all kinds of things, Black Lives Matter movement, or indeed clerical sex abuse victims, or there are all these different signs that we know that dignity and we're seeking something better. So it ends on that, I think, very hopeful note, and an invitation to us all to transcend ourselves, to decenter ourselves, to go out in service of others, as Father Michal said, to bear the burdens of others, and have that culture of service. This is the kairos, the opportunity of this moment, which he's inviting us to embrace. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Austen. And you've been able to pull together in a very concise but helpful way the themes of the book and how they are relevant to our conversation today. And of course, this question of crisis is really quite profound. I was just reflecting not very long ago that when we read the history of the 20s and 30s and what happened in Europe, there's a great deal said about the impact of the First World War and what happened then. And there's very little said about the impact of the 1918 to 1920
of Spanish flu. Absolutely.
But those of us that are living through this at the moment are so overwhelmed with the pandemic that it's hard to believe the 1918-1920 flu pandemic did not have an enormous impact on what happened globally in the 20s and 30s after that. So, as you say, the pandemic has not so much created things as exposed and to some degree exacerbated the problems that are already there and have been there. I suppose there were two thoughts that were around in my mind, which you may wish to respond to, and the second one in particular, I think we're going to come to Sally to respond. The first one is that 40 years on, we had this enormous event in Poland, and it ricocheted right around the world, and important things happen. And yet, when we go 40 years on, kind of 2 generations roughly, it's as though the whole thing is not quite consolidated back down to where it was, but nevertheless, a lot of the inspiration and the vibrancy and the passion seems to have gone out of it. And of course, this is part of the human condition. It's as though a generation arises which are impelled to do something, change things dramatically, sometimes in a revolutionary way, although that could turn out really rather badly, but certainly to create new change and so on. Then the next generation starts making rules about it. And then the generation after that starts saying, well, yes, and then there are all these people who break the rules, and we've got to do something about that. And the whole thing becomes about regulation and legislation, and the spirit seems to kind of go out of it. So I guess the first question that I would have is something about this dilemma that seems to be almost part of our condition, that we have the inspiration, and then it seems to shrink back down into something that's much smaller than that.
And I think that's true of all of our lives, isn't it? I mean, there are periods in our lives where we are profoundly, I suppose, aware of our dependence on others, and indeed on God. And there are other periods where we turn in on ourselves. We believe that we're in charge of our own destiny, and we grow cold and we grow selfish. And we all know that the rapid economic growth and materialism, which is often also a lack of material goods, in other words, anxiety about material goods, drives out those other things which enable us to build a better society. So I think you're right. I mean, there's nothing new under the sun. I mean, that's why we have Lent every year, right? Is to try and recover. I mean, Francis is great. 3 great encyclicals. I think will always be considered Evangelii Gaudium, Laudato Si, and Fratelli Tutti. And these are 3 encyclicals concerned with the 3 core relationships of human beings with our Creator, with the created world, and with our fellow creatures. So that's that, if you like, 3 elements. Now, those ties, those bonds, which make us who we are, which give us our dignity, if you like, constantly need regeneration, because they can grow cold because we turn in on ourselves. And that's why a crisis, crises are not new, and crises in our life. I mean, he draws a lot of analogies in the book, I think very helpfully, between what he calls his personal COVIDs in his own life, and indeed the biblical COVIDs, what King David went through, or what St. Paul went through. Crises are wonderful moments for resetting, because they allow us, they break with all the things that we've come to rely on, we can no longer rely on. And in feeling helpless and powerless, we then turn back, we turn to God often because we have nowhere else to turn. And then we open ourselves to the grace and the mercy that is, and the strength and the vision and the new thinking that enables, which then allows us to open out to others. So yeah, it's cyclical, it's spiritual, it's in constant need of renewal and regeneration. We're definitely at the moment, I think, living through one of those moments of turning, and it's going to be fascinating to see where we are in 5 or 10 years' time.
Well, we're going to be losing you shortly, but there's a second question I wanted to put to you, which really, I think, though I don't know exactly what Sally's going to say, but I think leads a little bit into some of the territory of her interest. And that is, as I was reading the book, I to be honest, I started getting a bit impatient with it, because there was a lot of talk about the importance of the role of women, for example, other things as well, but that particular example. And here I am, I'm a Protestant from a Presbyterian church background, and I'm getting impatient, and I'm saying, what are you talking about, the role of women? Look at the Catholic Church, look at all the kinds of ways it's behaved and still does, and so on. And then as you get later in the book, you begin to, and I must confess, when Fratelli Tutti came out, I was thinking to myself, why isn't it Fratelli e Sorelle Tutti? Yes. Why isn't it brothers and sisters? And then as I get later on in the book, he begins to say, well, now I've appointed this woman to this position where she has a vote along with the cardinals and bishops, and even starts to use she on a number of occasions where you might have thought he might have used he just in the phraseology. And I got the sense, and yes, he says it in a couple of places, it's time is an issue here, can't change things that quickly, got to try to bring people along with you. I absolutely, coming from Ireland and Irish history and knowing you can't rush some things, are absolutely true. But isn't there this dilemma about the crisis which is sudden, and how do you take things forward when time is involved?
Right. Okay, okay. This is a very big question. I'll try and keep it short. Just sorry to be a kind of linguistic pedant, but fratelli in Italian includes both. In other words, in Italian, you say quanti fratelli hai, means how many brothers and sisters you have. And so fratelli, and the very first line of Fratelli Tutti is addressed to brothers and sisters. So but that's an argument we got into at the time. Look, I think on women in Let Us Dream, he's fascinating, because he's saying we need the leadership of women, and this crisis has revealed the importance of the distinctive leadership of women. And he says, look at the leaders at the moment of countries and the way they've responded to the pandemic. Some of the best responses have been countries led by women. So it's very interesting kind of space he's opening up. This is not classical feminism where it's about power. He's actually saying that women's leadership needs to challenge, in the case of the church, clerical male leadership. And we need that challenge because we need to change. And it's not just about simply incorporating women into positions of power, because then often women lose that power to challenge us. So I think it's an interesting and nuanced a position that he's carving out. And I think within the debates in the church, you see, I mean, the problem is that there never has been a female priesthood in the church, right? And therefore, for there would have to be, ecumenical council. I mean, we're talking about so the problem is that because of the impossibility of easily changing on that issue, we have an argument in our church which often goes between the progressives or the feminists who might say, to use a crude word, who say, until the church ordains women, I can't take the church seriously on gender equality. And on the other hand, you have kind of traditionalists who say, it's all carved in stone and, Jesus chose. Whereas he's opening up a very different space, saying, actually, we need women leaders, and we have women leaders. Some of the biggest organizations in the church are run by women. In Amazonia, you have entire church communities being run. Why don't we recognize those women as leaders? And if it's because they're not priests, then isn't that clericalism? So I think it's an interesting space. I don't expect him to in any way satisfy people outside the church who say, well, look, why doesn't he just ordain priests? But I think within the Catholic Church, I think it's a very important and interesting space he's opening up.
Yeah, I quite agree. And as I say, that's why I said right at the very beginning of our session today, read the book, but read it right through to the end, because I think he develops the argument. I mean, I come from a tradition which is actually moving the opposite direction. We've had women elders and women ordained ministers in the Presbyterian Church in Ireland, elders since the 1920s, ministers since the early 1970s. And now we're finding people want to turn that back. So it's a fascinating business. Well, you can see why that leads me on to Sally. Delighted
to be with you, Sally. I'm so sorry not to hear the rest of it, but I've enjoyed
good to see you. And let's hope we get back together again in Oxford before too long. We hope.
That would be lovely, John. Thanks, Sally.
Sally, let's come to you, Professor Sally Scholz from Villanova University in the United States. And what's your response? How do you react, both to the things you've already heard, but most particularly to the theme of today's webinar? You're very welcome. Lovely to see you, and thanks for joining us.
Oh, no, thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to be included, and I want to thank you and thank Eva Grossman as well for all of the work organizing this event. I think the topic is incredibly important and so timely. And I'm delighted to hear Austen's various remarks. And part of what I do as a philosopher is to look at the concepts and the values that they invoke, and how these ideas can kind of come together and in some sense conspire together to transform each other. And one of the things that I see Pope Francis doing in Fratelli Tutti and in the book is transforming the concept or the idea of solidarity even in Catholic social thought. It is, of course, still a piece with the tradition, and it's a very rich tradition, but he is doing something different as well. And so I'd like to just sort of raise three different points where I see something interesting going on there. And the first is to look at how solidarity challenges equality, or we might think of as equity. And when solidarity is paired with equality, it forces us to see what we can think of as the transitive qualities of equality. And by transitive properties there, I mean that equality in one sphere does not ensure equality in another, or you could think of it the opposite way. Inequality in one sphere is going to adversely impact one's capacities in other spheres. But solidarity, especially solidarity in the Catholic social tradition, is concerned not just with a single sphere, not with, for instance, just distribution of material goods. It is concerned with social justice. And within that Catholic social teaching tradition, solidarity is often, maybe even we could say usually, paired with subsidiarity. The two together work to bring out different communities, and there are different communities within which we can take leadership roles. So when you brought up the point about women in leadership in the church, I think one of the things in the book that the Pope is doing is drawing attention to the importance of those communities, and how paying attention to solidarity and subsidiarity actually shifts our focus. it's not to say that the hierarchy is unimportant or by any means, but it is to say that we can, within our own communities, within our own spheres of spheres of operation, however you want to say, spheres of life, we make a difference. And we take up leadership roles. We also, within those communities, foster solidarity within and across. And that's the transitive property. It forces us to look at how our leadership within our own communities affects and impacts the ability of other communities, other peoples to participate. So transforming it in this way, I think you can see that active in, for instance, social justice movements. Individuals uniting for a common cause to end injustice, oppression, or tyranny of any sort find their collective commitment, or find within their collective commitment the impetus to see beyond the single injustice and to identify the structures of injustice and to connect the dots, as it were, between the harms experienced by those who suffer injustice. Rather than merely seeking equality within one single arena, like the political arena, then solidarity encourages actors to understand and to demand the need for equity across different spheres of social existence. To realize that inequality in one sphere affects standing or capacity in another. And I think we can see this very clearly in the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, for instance. The activists have recognized the effects of advocacy against police brutality on other things like, for instance, access to education. So a second and related way that solidarity is transformed and transforms equity is that solidarity makes equity inclusive. And Austen and Father Paluch both mentioned this, and it's come up in previous sessions of this seminar as well. There are certainly forms of solidarity that rely on an in-group and an out-group, but I would argue that those are dangerous forms of solidarity, right? They're defining themselves in opposition to another, and I think that's contrary, certainly it's contrary to the Catholic social teaching version of solidarity, but I think it's contrary to the principle of solidarity more generally as well. Solidarity asks us to allow for connection across difference and to meet our disagreements with respect and dignity, and even to welcome and encourage the diverse and pluralistic views and experiences that each of us brings. And I might add here, connecting it to the transitive, our diversity is important within each of the subsidiary communities within which we're involved. In Catholic social teaching, the phrase is used that we are one human family. But of course, families are messy. And we disagree and we argue. But we also see the value in our connection and in our bond. And I'll mention briefly here, just because you brought it up, John, that there are times when for the good of the family, we have to think about how to restructure. And violence is one of those moments. If violence is entered into the family, it cuts off the ability to connect, to create bonds of solidarity. So I argue that solidarity cannot accommodate violence. And certainly I think that's consistent with a Catholic social teaching approach. And notice too that inclusive solidarity is intergenerational. And Pope Francis certainly highlights this in both Fratelli Tutti and in the book. Movements for social justice have long used the language of creating a better world for our children. They've also understood the need to teach children to care about justice, to teach the practices, culture, customs, and language of solidarity. In other words, intergenerational solidarity is not just thinking about the decisions, how our decisions affect future generations, it's also thinking about how we can foster in them the habit of justice or the habit of social change, recognizing that social justice is a long process and that we have to foster it and develop it and encourage it. We learn the language, we pass it on, okay? Let's see, in addition, I think part of that intergenerational solidarity is encouraging or teaching our children that they are human, that they are worthy of respect and dignity. That's what, as the previous speakers noted, that's what inspires the movement. But all too often, the world of social media or other dangerous influences cut us off from our ability to even see ourselves as worthy of dignity. And so we need to teach our children that and create that as part of our patterns of solidarity. And then finally, I would say that solidarity itself also transforms, or rather, let me flip that. Equity also transforms solidarity. One way to think of solidarity is as a willingness to share the risks that comes with social relations, to use the language used earlier, to carry each other's burdens. Most of the risks in our social context are willingly accepted, given the understanding that social existence itself lessens overall risks, that we're better off together than we are alone when facing threats of all kinds to our well-being. But shared social risk in solidarity means that participants accept that their actions, that our actions, put ourselves and our fellow actors at potentially increased risks. Risks that could harm our material, physical, or social well-being. Equitably sharing social risk requires that we create reciprocal relations. The points to emphasize our interconnectedness. In order to do that, we need to be aware of the different social risks that solidaristic actors take. The risks we take to be together in a society can exacerbate vulnerabilities and cause unintentional harm. If they're not shared equitably, trust is eroded. And I think you see this tremendously in the pandemic, where we allowed certain members of our social whole to carry a heavier burden and failed to take up our own positions of leadership within our communities, or to take responsibility for our own role in offsetting those risks or offsetting those burdens. But the idea of solidarity is that no one person or one entity should carry so much risk that they are made vulnerable because of it. So equity transforms solidarity. It forces us to think about the risks we take together and their effects on the most vulnerable, to pay attention to those relationships of trust. It requires we examine our own social position, that we know and what others know, and what we can learn from others, and what leadership positions we can take and allow others to take in our solidarity. So equity paired with solidarity emphasizes a sort of reflexive aspect of solidarity. Our actions are not just about a common cause, but that cause is reflected in the relations we have with one another. So those are just three things that I see emerging in this conjunction of solidarity and equity. And when they're brought together in this way, solidarity pushes equity to be transitive and inclusive. Equity pushes solidarity to be reflexive. And of course, we can look to social movements for guidance on the practice of this, and for insight on when it works and when it doesn't. Of course, I'll just end by saying that we are humans, and humans are fallible. And part of recognizing our solidarity and our equity is to also recognize when we fail, and to take responsibility for those failures, to learn from them and to recover, but also to recognize that in our failures, we might need to offset that risk a little bit, to lift the burdens of others for a time while they reset and recommit to the solidarity we have together. So those are just some initial thoughts.
Thank you very much indeed, Sally. And we're going to come now to Professor Tomasz Zyro. But just before we do, one thing I wanted to pick up with you very briefly, if I may. You talked about the intergenerational solidarity.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I sometimes feel, and perhaps I feel it increasingly as my beard gets more and more white, is that intergenerational solidarity is often interpreted as the current generation thinking about the welfare of the next generation.
Yes.
But of course, it's not a one-way traffic. At least I hope it's not a one-way traffic. And maybe if you say a little bit about that, and I guess it's, it's quite striking, both with John Paul II and with Francis, they are people who are of an age and yet can appeal to people who are younger and older. So very good examples in that kind of way. But of course, there's also this dilemma in the pandemic that, the older people are particularly vulnerable, although as they get vaccinated, it looks like younger people are now becoming a larger component of the intensive care unit. So it's a complex business, but I wanted just if you had a brief comment about that question of intergenerational solidarity.
Yes, good. Well, I'm so delighted that you pointed out that it has to be, what did you use, two-way street?
Yes.
Like that, yes. Because, one of the things that is often overlooked, and this is why I brought in subsidiarity too, which I think is such a powerful concept, and perhaps too often siloed to certain aspects of our social theorizing. But in reality, subsidiarity can be employed or helpfully thought through in thinking about these relations of intergenerational solidarity as well. Part of what subsidiarity does is to allow us to, as I said, take that leadership roles in our certain communities of interest. And young people have something important to give, to share, that we can learn from. All too often, we think of ourselves, and I even said it in my comments, as passing on our wisdom, our customs, our language of social change. But in fact, if you look at some of the social movements present in Black Lives Matters, is a really good one. But so is some of the movements to end sexual violence. It's the young people who are pushing the agenda and pushing a social transformation, and they're doing it in a creative way. Now, one of those ways is social media, and I actually think that social media works against solidarity rather than helps to build it. But what they're doing with the social media, I think, is important. They're sharing their narratives, and by sharing our stories, I think we create the space for that inclusive solidarity that can span the generations and work through time. But we have to be equipped to hear the stories and equipped to share them. That young people are using social media to share them means that I need to adapt and figure out, where I can enter in a helpful way. But it probably also means being, at least for a time, a passive listener while I accept and learn from others. So.
Thank you very much indeed, Sally. Professor Sally Scholz, thank you very much. And now we come to Professor Tomasz Zyro, a good friend now to this whole webinar series, as is political theology, which he represents, and from the University of Warsaw. Professor Zyro, it's a pleasure to see you. You have the mic and you have the video, and we look forward to what you have to say.
Finally, thank you. Thank you very much, Lord Alderdice. Of course, first of all, I'd like to thank organizers for inviting me to the debate. I appreciate very much such an initiative that offers a space, if it is cyberspace, not only to consider the solidarity means, but also to reinvigorate the idea of solidarity. For some understandable reasons, I start with some remarks concerning solidarity both as a social movement, as the idea, the solidarity with a capital letter. The John Paul's two pontificates swept across Poland with a wave of awakening, brought about both a refreshed feeling for freedom but a strive for liberty. I didn't say that my remarks are divided into parts. First of all, is about the relationship between solidarity and equality, and according to the Polish experience of solidarity. The second part is about the contemporary generation answer, which is a completely its face is completely with completely different facets, I would say. The year of 1989 was, as Christian Kumar put it, the annus mirabilis. Emphatically speaking, the solidarity political victory can be perceived as a completion of the Atlantic Revolution that once so aptly described Robert Palmer. The rise of solidarity movement will justify analogy to other momentous events, which raised successive waves of democratization. The American Revolutionary War and the French Revolution abolished absolutism. Solidarity disposed of communism. True political mechanisms were, however, obscured by the euphoria that disintegration of the bipolar world order had generated. At the same time, a revolution, or to put it in Timothy Ash's vocabulary, revolution, have revolution brought forth East Europeans a staggering experience of the human ability to begin again, similar to that described so masterfully by Hannah Arendt in her study on revolution. So you can connect this experience to begin again in the contemporary context of the crisis, social and political crisis resulted by the epidemic. The Atlantic revolutions announced a triumph of the Enlightenment project and seduced the minds of many. Communists strive for implanting a doubtful version of modernization, which, however, grew out of the Enlightenment's premises. They pretended to be harbingers of the new era. On the other hand, they perceived themselves as heralding the end of history. There's a kind of paradox in such assertions. The communist ideology stated a dialectical and logical conclusion of modernity. Consequently, the end of communism posed questions regarding the Enlightenment heritage. In 1980-81, during the first phase of the Solidarity movement, this is the Polish workers who were to inflict the very blow, I would say, straight to the heart, to the communist ideology. Their resistance to the communist regime demythologized and demystified the historical dialectics. Thanks to the Solidarity movement, the working class ceased to be the avant-garde that paved a road toward communism. A core of the Marxist ideology was crushed. Marxism started to languish in its charm and appeal. The poverty of such a form of historicism became obvious. For many Western thinkers, it was a heartbreaking experience. The Solidarity movement was a point de départ to transfer their revolutionary hopes to other social forces. For a time being disillusioned, they began to relentless quest that never stops until these days. I could offer some sample of such theories, beginning from Sorel's followers through Reich hope about students and youth generally, Michel Foucault's admirers that opted for, and so on and so on. It's very interesting that Donna Haraway in the Cyborg Manifest postulates that it's good to join women's forces with cyborgs. Even this brief overview shows conclusively that solidarity with the other is feasible under one condition. Liberation necessitates emphasis upon particularity, which is quite opposite to the question, to the problem of solidarity offered by John Paul II. What's more interesting in that movement originated by John Paul's II reflection on solidarity that found its place in Catechism of the Catholic Church. Social justice is tightly linked to common good and political power. Number 1928. This kind of reflection culminated not only the idea of solidarity, but of course also the experience of the collective movement named solidarity. So equality is in essential relationship with human dignity and person's rights. A rule not to discriminate doesn't mean to equalize difference. Talents, virtues are unequally apportioned. The original idea for solidarity was universal, metapolitically situating beyond clash of political ideological orientations. It had a huge potential to emancipate, but not in narrow sense formulated by any progressives in their liberating projects. It frames a completely opposite concept to them. Teaches how to cooperate, not to fight. It is based upon caritas and dilectio proximi, recalling some tenets of political anthropology, whereby the other is a person. Before scholars from Stanford University began to conceptualize the question of dignity as the democracy's third core value, this value animated the Polish revolt against the so-called rural socialism. In a basic sense, solidarity is to deliver a condition for just social order, providing the Lebenswelt, the spheres of life, to live her or his life in a dignified manner. The idea of solidarity might have shaken the world. One anarchist claimed that dynamite is a great equalizer. For sure, solidarity as the idea in social movement consisted even in the international domain a dynamite message. It brought forth a non-violent proposition to universal emancipation. And equity or social justice leads to a conception of good society and good life. Here I could tell us a long story about the fate of the concept, which have very serious consequences, but I only point out to some of them. First of all, after the illusory victory of solidarity, several advisors, lobbyists, constitutionalists, businessmen, spies swarmed Poland to teach us democratic values and free market benefits, centuries of the republican political culture of Polish Commonwealth notwithstanding. The new liberal order set into motion so-called economic and social transition. As a consequence of Polish workers and Polish intelligentsia, the only social hindrances to accrued appropriation were denigrated. Those who started civil disobedience became victims of the transition. So now I try to delineate another story about solidarity in present times. The solidarity stripped the leftist conceptual frameworks of its content. Systemic thinking about abrupt social change went in disarray, but regains impetus in 21st century. To explain it, one must consider outcomes of democratic revolution that accelerates in the times of rapidly growing economic inequalities. Democratic revolution means and radicalized the constant and inevitable progress of equality. The insatiable thirst for progress and emancipation was redirected toward the sphere of culture. The idea of solidarity is written in a specific context, whereby the postmodernist thinking dominates the public narrative or public discourse. This kind of kinky thinking, directed previously against consensual politics and generally against liberal democracy, has serious consequences in social political practices. It radicalizes politics in the Western civilization. So let's take a glimpse upon the politics of difference. It's exclusivist because certain groups, strata are located on the wrong side of history. It begins to exclude, not to include. In this way, the concept of solidarity radically changed its meaning. By a method of social construction, adherents to the politics of difference are able to point out who are expatriates in the contemporary society dominated by hostile forces. This new concept of double plurality linked with the principle of difference culminated in that we could call the politics of difference. The democratic revolution is endless, enabling to find out the spheres of injustice are numberless. Solidarity with the image of constructing victims frames the social justice. But on the other hand, the dominant agent can at will peg who is oppressed. Such ideological screeds result in a symptomatic social and cultural screed. And now there's a passage from the Jean Baudrillard how to create, instead of basic social reality, create image or myth of the reality. There are 4 steps. I skip over because time is running rapidly out. When the real world at last became a myth, a simulacrum, as Baudrillard asserts, we are witnessing the death not only of truth and science, but also of common sense itself. In such a way, social constructivists can deny any cumbersome report on reality by creating a liberating myth of equal society, by exposing several oppressed minorities. The construction of order is, however, relentless in this pursuit, since justice is impossible to achieve. This is the famous thesis by one of the philosophers, contemporary, very popularized and popular. This pursuit, seemingly animated by joyful nihilism, but resentment and violence are swirling underneath. Is in such a social cultural frame possible to bob up any community? The answer is yes, it is. But the result is the fluid community doomed by temporality, a community of contingent members, roles, groups. To put it in one word, it is a flaky community. So it is legitimate to pose a question: is there any alternative either to democratic liberal practices or utopian visions of the radical democracy? There are several visions spanning from the Ultima Thule to utopia based upon some questions, some topics of equal or egalitarian outcomes. So the emancipators are marching as an avant-garde of the democratic revolution. They are, as they postulate, they are on the right side of historical process. So the Western civilization witnessed several stages of democratic revolution, and I skip over it, but the radical version of equality enforced demands to get rid of any form of enslavement by political authority, tradition, manners, habits, prejudices. Equality is defined in all possible vocabulary, save for postulates of limiting a growing polarity of poor and rich. It is very interesting from the political sociology point of view that many emancipators are speaking about emancipation, but emancipation from human nature, gender, manners, but with one exception to the rule: economic disastrous stratification. If we take up some tools provided by political sociology, we would find consistent explanation of this striking absence, or using postmodern vocabulary, non-presence. Almost all progressive movements, ideas, strategies are financed by big money, and progressives' goal is to construct a simulacrum of equality. If you want to understand how it works, Leah Hans Hendricks Foundation Solidaire offers an exemplary case for studying the new concept of solidarity. Now, right now, I offer some conclusions. I briefly present 2 approaches to concept of solidarity that constitute completely different social and political practices. Thus, the original meaning of such concept solidarity that needs to be based on the well-ordered community is foundationalist in its nature, and any referral to the order is essentialist. For seekers of radical solutions, such assumptions are, of course, reactionary, and their proponents have obviously to be compartmentalized as fascists. There is no space for them even in public discourse. and in near future a decision to unplug them from the Lebenswelt of the new global order seems to be necessary. For those who laud it, this will undoubtedly be the elementary act of equity. Thanks to persuasive terminology, such a process of naming invites us to the new brave world. The invitation, what is interesting, is formulated in the name of solidarity, equality, and social justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Zyro. Time is running away with us, but I think one of the things that particularly struck me from what you said, from my own experience too, is this question of dignity as a profoundly important, indeed an absolutely key value. Certainly when I've seen intractable political violence, whatever the economic differences there have been, and there often are, the sense of unfairness and especially any sense of loss of dignity, of humiliation and disrespect, these are profoundly toxic experiences for individuals and communities. And I thank you for drawing our attention to that. Well, what I'd invite is for the three of you perhaps to say something about what has struck you about the presentations, and of course not forgetting the presentation earlier on by Austen on the book Let Us Dream by Pope Francis. So I'd invite you to, if you would like to indicate, just put your hand up, and I'll invite each of you to make perhaps a brief contributions before we finish in less than 15 minutes now. Father Michal and then Sally. Father Michal.
Yes, thank you very much for very interesting and compact as well and rich presentations I could follow. I would say that you know, I kept thinking during our meeting about this comparison proposed by Austen between the current crisis we are going through and the solidarity movement. How to see it together, how to put it together, taking into account the experience we are trying to analyze and to understand a little bit better after 40 years. And it's just some initial reflections, but I would say that each popular movement or each crisis has its momentum. So we are coming to a moment which may be used to redefine something, to propose something new, and so on. And this crucial moment needs a good leader, needs in general leadership, a good leader who is capable, you know, to articulate what we are getting through in a right way. Well, in the case of the solidarity movements, I took the example of John Paul II because of obvious reasons, I think, but he wasn't the only leader. But in general, I would say this, and I think that 1987 was very special for as such a moment. It was long enough after the beginning, and it gave him the time to think how to articulate this movement. So I would say that that if we want to see the situation today in such terms, the biggest challenge we have is leadership, and as well I would say. Our experience is much more complicated because, you know, it will much more black and white to some extent in ethical terms what we went through in the 80s. So my first reflection is a little bit on the leadership. I would say I would integrate as well what Sally said on I would describe it, how solidarity makes changes inside of our understanding of power, responsibility, leadership as well. So subsidiarity as one of the results of social thinking we should take into account. It's very inspiring to see that if we start to think in terms of solidarity, all the games of power, responsibility, and leadership must be changed, so to say. And for example, because of that, there is some hope that we shouldn't be looking for one biggest leader in the world who will solve all our problems. Our solving problems process might start as well on the bottom, in the dynamic bottom up, and not only that it should start on the top. And the second thing I would like to mention is coming back as well to Austen's presentation, because it was so dynamic and the first after my presentation, I guess. So it caught my attention. See, Judge, Act, Francis's proposal and Jesuit proposal as well, and in such a way, Catholic proposal. I would say that my impression is, and I would say that Professor Zyro presentation was a very good, full of examples for that we have, first of all, the problem today we've recognized certain facts that do not enter what we want to see, and I just one example I would like to share with you is Urbi and Orbi blessing of the Pope each year. It started for me in the time of John Paul II, but I was always astonished at the picture of the world given by the Pope in his Urbi and Orbi blessing, and how was it different from our news services. So it was a different world, and so I would say that one of our challenges is, if we want change the inequalities of the world, is be able to see, to recognize facts and confront ourselves with a huge set of facts we don't want to see in our, let's say, better side, better part of the world, richer part of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Father Michal. Professor Sally, you wanted to make an intervention.
Yes, just a small thing, and so much of our comments focused on solidarity as a reaction to injustice or a reaction to crisis, and I think it's just important to also understand that solidarity is part of the context within which we respond, it's also the sort of moral relation that we foster in times when we're not in crisis. The See, Judge, Act approach in Catholic social thought has also been paralleled with conversion, communion, and solidarity, and that appears especially in some of the U.S. Catholic bishops' letters on migration. And I think it's a really helpful way to transform the See, Judge, Act for different contexts. Conversion requires a change of heart, and in that change of heart, we have to see ourselves as culpable, as part of the problem, and when we react to crisis, it's not just us, them, it's us. It's how do we also change so that the crisis is not a crisis, but in our solidarity can be lived out in a genuine way, and others can be brought in, which leads to the communion. So yeah, I'll stop there, but I wanted to mention that.
Thank you very much indeed. Professor Tomasz, I wonder if I might come to you. Father Michal was talking about the question of leadership and how leadership is immensely important, and yet the danger of looking to a single leader. Of course, the problem at the moment is not so much the difficulty of a single leader as the difficulty of almost no leadership at all, and no great sense of that. Now, when we talk about seeing, we think of the question of vision, but vision doesn't just mean seeing. Vision means something that takes us beyond what we can see, actually. And while we may not be able to or even wish to have a single leader because of the problems of that, do you think that there is a problem about the vision, about having a vision? Because I have the sense that this is one aspect of the problem too.
After your question, I recall to my mind Alexis de Tocqueville's remarks about how democracy works, and I think that we are facing the one of the phases of the democratic process when leadership weakens to some extent, significant extent. I mean that politicians right now are so involved in the day-by-day politics that they are not able to offer any vision, because let's say from the etymological point of view, there is a present contemporary very popular catchword: woke. What does it mean, woke? To woke, to wake up the politicians' minds to challenges, or there is any problems with the public communications, because we can facing a kind of distorted message, distorted by social media message from politicians. So there are two problems. There is a problem of the personality, I would say, because democracy works in this way that minimize the challenge from the big personalities. And the second question is, second problem is about the public communication, which is distorted in a significant way by for example, GAFAM or some other platforms.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, we've come to the end of our time. And I guess what has struck me from listening to the four extremely valuable and thought-provoking presentations is that we are in a curious time, because 40 years ago, solidarity meant people coming together against something, against a political structure, against a way of doing politics, a way of doing governance, a sense that there was something that needed to be brought down in order that something new might be able to be created. Now we're facing a crisis, which is a crisis that is destroying things. It's destroying lives, it's destroying relationships, it's destroying economies. So it's not a matter of something, a revolution that brings something down. It's the question of whether we have the vision and the leadership to create something new. And I don't think I'm being unfair to say that as young people, and indeed older people, look around, they don't see a very obvious vision that they can grasp hold of in terms of political theory and ideas, in terms of economic proposals, structures. In none of these areas do people feel a great sense of inspiration. They don't believe that politicians have the answer, that economists have the answer, that the business world has the answer, that military power has the answer. Seems all of these things have in their own different ways failed. And it does seem to me that it leaves a tremendous opportunity for what one might describe as spiritual vision. And I think we are seeing elements of that. We've mentioned, of course, Pope Francis. I think it would be fair to say that in the Anglican communion too, the Archbishop of Canterbury has been a somewhat inspirational figure. And I'm not without hope that not only in the wider Christian community, the Orthodox community, including those who are under frightful pressure in the Middle East, sometimes have important things to say and very, very courageous leaders, but also within other religious communities, and indeed those who would not describe themselves as religious, but still have a real sense of humanity, of dignity. And in that sense, I might just say that this is not soft power. In a sense, the search for dignity can be stronger than dynamite if we are able to espouse it with the passion and enthusiasm that it deserves. And I hope that as we, those of us who have participated directly, and those who have been listening in on Zoom and on Facebook, leave this discussion today, they will do so with a sense that this is a time where we desperately need the vision, the passion, and the inspiration that takes us beyond where we are at now. Just yesterday, I was talking with some friends from Peru about how difficult things are there. They're difficult for people in general, they're very difficult for indigenous people, they're difficult for older people, younger people, people in the mountains, people in the cities. These are tough and difficult times, but the challenge may then be not to sit back and relax and be at ease in Zion, because there is no ease in Zion at this time, but rather to be inspired. And I want to thank all four of you. Andreas is not with us now, but Professor Tomasz, Zyro, Father Michal Paluch, and Professor Sally Scholz. Thank you very much indeed for the very thoughtful and provocative and encouraging presentations that you've made. It's all going to be available, as these things are nowadays, in a recording, which I'm sure others will want to pick up. And I thank you very much indeed. And can I thank also all those organizations who have come together under Eva's leadership to make this webinar today, and indeed to make this series possible, because this is the last of the current series, but I'm sure not the last of the webinars that we will be doing together. Thank you very much indeed to all of you for an excellent afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.